Good afternoon, everyone. It is Sunday, January the 31st, 2021. It is currently 4:02 p.m. Central Time, and I'm coming to you from the sanctuary of Victory Baptist Church, located right here in Ovalo, Texas. I want you to try to listen to what is currently going on in this room right now. I want you to really listen carefully and see if you can hear what is happening in this room. I'm in the sanctuary. I'm here in the back of the sanctuary. Right here, the pews are in front of me. Right in front of me are pews. Over to my right, there are pews. Way up ahead, there's the pulpit. Behind it is the cross on the wall. There's the piano to the left of the pulpit. Here I am in the sanctuary of Victory Baptist Church. Listen. Do you hear that? You may be like, I think I heard something. Yeah, you heard my iPad send a notification about a news article. Ignore that. Listen to everything else. Do you hear it? Listen. You probably get what you probably know what the point I'm trying to make, because you've seen the title of this episode. Yes, I'm sitting here in an empty building, so it's just me. I'm the only one here. And when I stop talking, it's the sound of silence. There's just me and silence. Every once in a while I can hear a car go by on the highway here near the church, but it's just silence. So if I sit here, if I turn on this microphone and I don't talk to you, then I would be experiencing in this room, if I just sit here, I would be experiencing solitude and silence. Solitude and silence. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because we're going to be talking about solitude and silence. Because we have come to chapter 20 of the book, The Imitation of Christ. We're in book 1, The Imitation of Christ, chapter 20. Book 1, chapter 20 of The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. And the name of this chapter is The Love of Solitude and Silence. Now, if you remember in the previous chapter, he started talking about the exercises of a religious person. Now, remember, when he talks about the exercise of a religious person, he's talking about the person who's a part of a religious order, like a monk or a nun, a part of a religious order in the Catholic Church. But he's now going to take this idea of these exercises that a religious person, and we still will have to understand it in that context, a monk and a monastery. But he wants us to talk about this exercise of solitude, or this love of solitude and silence. Now, I want you to ask yourself a very important question. Do you love solitude? Do you love to be completely by yourself in an empty house? Or an empty building, just completely by yourself? Do you love solitude? I mean, honestly, do you love it? You say, well, I love it, but only for a very short time. Like, how long can you go with just being by yourself? Let me ask you a question. Let's even take this out of maybe a religious context. And I asked this question because we had a very interesting social experiment at the hospital I worked in. Me and one of the doctors got into this discussion about people not liking to go anywhere by themselves, right? They don't like to go by themselves. For example, last year at this time, in fact, today is, I know if you're a wrestling fan, you could care less, but today is the Royal Rumble pay-per-view. Here, right now, the pre-show is on right now. Let me tell you, it's killing me not to be at home watching the pre-show. This is not quite the Super Bowl for professional wrestling. It's like a conference championship game. This is the pay-per-view that kicks off the road to the wrestling Super Bowl, which is WrestleMania. I know you don't care, but just let me explain. It's a big deal for a wrestling fan. Last year, for the same pay-per-view, the Royal Rumble happens every year. I was in Houston, Texas. All right. I was in Houston, Texas, and I was at Minute Maid Park with 50, 60, 70,000 other people. And I went to the Royal Rumble pay-per-view by myself. My wife came to Houston with me, but she didn't go to the pay-per-view. She stayed in the hotel. Well, she ultimately ended up in the emergency room, and then she kept it from me because she wanted me to enjoy the pay-per-view, which is that's a loving wife, not to want to mess up a wrestling pay-per-view for someone. So I didn't have a clue that she was in the emergency room. And then when the pay-per-view was over, I go to the hotel. I'm like, where's my wife? And she's gone. Okay. But I went to that pay-per-view completely by myself. I didn't need anybody with me. I mean, fine, I can go. I've gone to, I'll go out to eat by myself. I'll go to a movie by myself. I'll go to a concert by myself. I'll go to a wrestling event by myself. I'll go anywhere by myself. It doesn't bother me in the slightest. I could care less. What difference does it make? I go by myself. But so we did a social experiment in the hospital where we did a survey of everyone who worked in the hospital of how many people who like to go by themselves, who don't like by themselves, who will not go by themselves, who prefer to go by themselves. And we asked it in all kinds of different ways. And then we kind of looked up all the statistics because this is what, I don't know. We always like to explore topics. The doctors, whenever we would hang out, usually during lunch, we would always have these great big philosophical conversations about all kinds of things. And a lot of times we would then take these philosophical conversations and then try to do some kind of experiment to prove one point or disprove a point. So we wanted to know if we could determine the cause for why some people just like, I cannot go anywhere by myself. I hate being by myself. I don't like being by myself. I can't stand it. And now what the doctors concluded in their study is that people with advanced degrees they were far less bothered by going somewhere by themselves. If they had an advanced degree, they didn't care. People who had lower educational levels, they seemed greatly bothered by it. Now, that was not completely scientific. It was a small sample study of the people in the hospital. I mean, still a lot of people, but that's how they decided to break it down. Now, that's trying to cause and effect, and does it prove cause and effect? You get the idea. But let me ask you, would you go to a wrestling pay-per-view by yourself? Would you go to the movie by yourself? Would you go out to eat by yourself? And you say, well, I would do it, but I would hate it. Why? Why would you hate it? Why do you hate being somewhere by yourself? Now, some people, other people look at me like I'm weird. Well, now that's a whole different subject for a different sermon. Now you're worried and preoccupied with what people think. That's a problem in and of itself. That's a spiritual problem because there's no reason being a Christian if you're going to worry about what other people think of you. Okay, because you've picked the wrong religion. Okay, but that's a whole different story. But what is it? So can you figure out why? And then let's just take away going places. Just being in a room by yourself or a building or a home. How long can you do that before you're like, I just can't do this. I can't do this. I can't do this. Why? What is it about solitude that you hate? How about silence? Can you, like one of my favorite jobs I ever had in the military, and I cried when I finally got moved from the job, was the NCOD, non-commissioned officer of the day. I was in charge of the hospital for the day. It was my response. I was responsible for everything. Death certificates, taking bodies to the morgue, security. If there was an emergency, I had prepared things for next day surgeries, all these things. But 80% of that work, other than that I was in the emergency room or admitting a patient or when I was engaged with patients, most of that time, I worked overnight, and most of that time I was completely 100% by myself. And an office by myself, or walking around a big empty hospital, going into the dental floor. Nobody there, everything shut down, just making sure all the doors were locked, almost pitch black, just walking around, going to the surgical ward, going downstairs. I mean, the hospital's pretty much empty other than the emergency room. The rest of the hospital was pretty much empty. The only place we had patients were the OBGYN floor had patients who were having a baby or having babies, or the mental health clinic had inpatients. But most of the time, most of the evening, I didn't see anyone or coming in any contact with anyone. I loved that. Completely by myself. I loved it. Other people hated that job, drove them crazy. They did not like just sitting there in an empty place by themselves. Or they would do everything they can to make sure they had something playing, some kind of noise, something going on, because they didn't like the silence. Another favorite job, when I was security forces, I would get put in what's called a whiskey post out in the middle of nowhere, literally nowhere, watching a fence. And you'd be there from, 6 o'clock at night to 6 in the morning. And I mean, you're completely by yourself, just sitting in a post, watching a fence, making sure no one tried to breach the fence. And the chances of anyone trying to breach the fence of that part of the military installation was pretty much, zero. Okay. And you would just sit there in an empty room, a little a portable building is basically what it was. And you would just sit there. Now you could get out and walk around with your M16. You could walk around, but basically you just sat there. The only time you saw anyone is when you called for a bathroom break and someone would come pick you up and take you to the bathroom and then bring you back. But most of the time you just sat there by yourself. Silence for 12 hours. I loved it. I loved every second of it. I wish I could have spent every day there. I was like, this is the greatest thing in the world. I could just sit there and think and talk and to myself or whatever, read. Now, reading was difficult. It was actually, you couldn't really read very well because, you're looking down. You're supposed to be looking and someone would sneak up on you and you'd get in trouble. So you really couldn't do too much reading, but you could just kind of sit there. I didn't have any problem with it, but some people hate that. Now, why? Why? So first, I want us just to really, and I know I'm spending a lot of time thinking about this. Someone just sent me a message here. Someone said, no complaints going to movies or restaurants alone. Years of business travel train you for it. That's interesting. I admit I don't like complete silence, though. Okay, interesting. And I think that's true. Some certain jobs kind of train you for, you just get used to it. Being alone. If you're doing business travel, you're going all kinds of places by yourself. That's a good point. I think sometimes you can get trained for this, but solitude and silence. So I'm getting us thinking about this. Now, here's the big question. Here's the one. How critical do you think solitude and silence is to one's spiritual maturity? Can one truly grow spiritually without the discipline, without the exercise of solitude and silence? Or how does the lack of solitude and silence hurt or hinder one's spiritual growth? How critical do you think it is to one's spiritual growth? Solitude and silence. Solitude and silence. Now, of course, remember, Thomas à Kempis is writing this in light of someone in a monastery. Now, depending on the type of monastery, there was a documentary on Amazon Prime that I absolutely loved. It was, I think the monastery is in France. I can't remember the name of the order, but they basically take a vow of silence. They don't communicate. And it would show that the monastery, the documentary just showed these monks and they live a life of silence. Now, I think there was like maybe once a week that they would go out of the monastery, and then they could walk and talk with one another. I think for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, it may have been an hour, and they could have some communication. But the rest of the time, they lived in complete silence, other than when listening to mass or listening to the scripture being read or listening to spiritual reading. But you spent a large portion of your time in a very small room that had a desk, had a Bible, a notebook, and some spiritual books, like, say, The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. That's how they spent their life. And when I watch it, I'm fascinated by it. Now, obviously, we're not calling for that. Right? Obviously, we would reject that because we believe as Christians we're to be in the world. But being in the world, not of the world, being in it, and trying to advance spiritually, how critical is solitude and silence? I don't know if I have an answer. I could look, and here's the reason I don't think I have an answer, and I'm going to be honest with this. Solitude and silence doesn't bother me, but here's the thing: it didn't bother me before I became a Christian. So I can sit there and go, look, I love solitude and silence. I'm more spiritual than you. I pat myself on the back here. You can't see. I pat myself on the back. Okay. But that doesn't make me, it does not make me any spiritual, because that's a fleshly thing. I just have no problem being by myself. I have no problem I can sit there for 4 hours in silence thinking about this, thinking about that, meditating on this, thinking about this. I could sit there reading. It doesn't bother me in any way, shape, or form. Even when I was very little, my parents thought I was crazy, but I would go off, find a closet. I would find a closet, take a little transistor radio, and just sit in that closet for 5-6 hours completely by myself, and it was perfectly okay. I didn't need to be around anyone. When I was very, very little, I would get on the bus, go to the library, stay at the library all day. Didn't need anyone. I didn't care about any of that. So for me, I could sit here and say, see, you need solitude and silence if you want to be as godly as I am. But my love for solitude and silence is more fleshly than it is spiritual. So then I can't use myself as the example. I can't use that's a fleshly thing. See, sometimes some of what we think, where we are so strong spiritually, sometimes we're strong spiritually and it's nothing more than a fleshly thing. My love for reading was there prior to conversion, so I can't say that, see, I have a love for reading. That means I'm more godly than you. I had a love for reading before conversion. See, so sometimes we look for things that we think is our spiritual strength when all it is really just a fleshly thing. It's not a spiritual thing. That's a whole discussion right there. So let's I know that's a long intro, but I really want you thinking about solitude and silence and how critical you think it is. Let's see what Thomas à Kempis has to say in regards to this. Are you ready? Here we go. All right. That was a 16-minute introduction. I know that's ridiculous, but that's okay. Here we go. When there's no way we're going to finish this chapter. There's no way. I'm looking at this chapter. We're going to have to break this down into a couple of parts, all right? But I just think it's interesting. He goes right from the exercises of a religious person, and then it's almost like here's the first major exercise he thinks needs to take place. And probably in their monastery, it was probably required, but let's look at this. Love of solitude and silence. Seek a convenient time. Now, I've got 2 translations here, so just keep that in mind. Seek a convenient time to yourself and meditate often upon God's loving kindness. So here's his instruction. You need to seek a convenient time to yourself and meditate often upon God's loving kindness. So I just think about this. If you were, like right here, I'm in this empty building. If this microphone was on, could I sit here for an hour, right? I've found a convenient time, and I just meditate on God's loving kindness. Now, first, you got to know God's loving kindness. You got to know the scriptures about God's loving kindness. You got to know how God manifested his loving kindness. You'd have to think about that. But could you sit there and meditate on it for an hour? Now, some people would have a hard time because they would start thinking about it, and then next thing you know, it would be like, I joke with my oldest daughter all the time about this because this is the way I always say my daughter is. She'll be like, hey, butterfly. Hey, did you butterfly? And she's just like, she's on one thing and whoop, she just detour. Anything can just distract her and she's off point and she's somewhere. And I'm like, hello, weren't we talking about this? Okay. Some people like they can sit there. Okay. All right. I'm going to meditate on God's loving kindness. Okay. Meditate on God's loving kindness. God's loving, man, I wonder what we're going to have for lunch tomorrow. Oh, wait. Okay. Meditate on God's loving kindness. Okay. Man, I bet it's windy outside right now. And just start going somewhere else. This requires a very disciplined mind to just seek a convenient time and then meditate often upon God's loving kindness. Let's continue. Forsake curious questionings, but read diligently. Let me read this again. But read diligently matters which rather yield contrition to your heart than occupation to your head. Whoa, this is some powerful words here, right? Let's go through this again. First part's easy. Find a convenient time, meditate often on God's loving kindness. But he says, forsake curious questionings. Now here, I'm not so sure I agree with this. I think one of the valuable things of solitude and silence is to consider, as his words, curious questionings. Now, I understand there's some questions that are of no true benefit, but I don't even know if I agree with that, because I think all questions, they may not lead to a great beneficial conclusion, but the process of questioning, the process of struggling, the process of thinking, I think is beneficial. I think if you're sitting there for an hour questioning and struggling with a question, yes, maybe at the end of the hour you don't have a satisfactory answer, but I think the questioning is beneficial. So this is he has a certain goal in mind. I think the questioning, or working through the question, to me, the question itself is like sometimes the goal isn't the answer. I know this sounds like this is my philosophy, all of my philosophy degrees coming into play here, but sometimes I think the question is more valuable than the answer. Thomas à Kempis has a different approach here. He doesn't want, he's not trying to benefit. What he wants to do in Solitude and Silence is not benefit the brain. He wants to benefit, in fact, his words is, he wants to benefit the contrition to your heart. He wants to benefit the heart, not the brain. I think you can use time of solitude and silence for the benefit the brain, the mind, your knowing, your understanding, and I think you can find time for solitude and silence to benefit the heart. I think sometimes what benefits the heart is the thinking, because I mean that's the whole Christian mentality is we have to know that the knowledge of God is what impacts the heart. We have to know God, and to know God is to know ourselves. To know ourselves is then to see ourselves as we really are, and then we become convicted by it. So I think knowing is critical here. But let's read this again. So forsake curious questionings, but read diligently matters which rather yield contrition to your heart than occupation to your head. So he wants you to read things that's going to bring contrition, conviction, repentance to your heart, not just occupy your head. Not just to occupy your head. Now, that's always a danger. We can read scripture and just become occupied in our head and just know something. I always hope and pray, and this is why I talk about it even when I teach Bible study methods, that at some point you have to apply what you learn. Application is just as a critical part of Bible study as exegesis, as exegeting the text. Application is just as important. So I just think he wants to focus on the contrition to your heart, and I completely understand that. But I just don't think you can necessarily get to the contrition out of your heart without the knowledge, without occupying your head. I think occupying your head with questions can lead to a greater understanding, which then can lead to a greater contrition of the heart. I just think that we need a balance here. I think we need a little of both. But all right, let's continue. I'll turn the page if it doesn't fall out. All right, here's page 42 in my copy. If you will withdraw yourself from speaking vainly and from, as his word is, gadding idly, so we'll just say this, if you'll withdraw yourself from speaking vainly and just being idle, as also from hearkening after new things and rumors, you shall find time enough and suitable for meditation on good things. In other words, if you don't waste your time speaking vainly, just running around talking about anything and everything, and if you don't waste your time just being idle, just sitting around just idly doing nothing, and if you will not waste time hearing new things and rumors, like running around going, ooh, what about this and what about that? If you kind of avoid all of these things, discipline yourself not to waste your time with all of this other stuff, then according to Thomas à Kempis, you're going to find plenty of time for meditating on good things. All right? Again, we need balance here. We definitely need to meditate on good things. I completely agree with that. All right? We need discipline. I agree with that. Let's continue. The greatest saints avoided when they could the society of men, and did rather choose to live to God in secret. Now, that's a big claim. Now, he is claiming that the greatest saints in the history of our faith avoided, when they could, the society of men. That the greatest saints would avoid the society of men, remove themselves, withdraw themselves. Again, I think that's dangerous. And again, I understand this is written from a Catholic perspective of living in a monastery where you've withdrawn yourself from the society of men. And I know that there was that joke, which is based on some truth, that there was times in church history where there were more Christians in monasteries than there were in cities. All the Christians left the cities and flocked to the monasteries because they believed that's what they had to do. They had to forsake everything to live to God. The only problem is then there's no witness in the city. So I think we need at times to avoid the society of men for spiritual benefit. But the spiritual benefit has to be then that we can go back and be in amidst the society of men so that we can be a light, that we can be salt, and that we can be a witness and a testimony and an example, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, and then these saints would rather choose to live to God in secret. Well, living to God in secret is not salt and light to the world. So, all right. But again, we can just reject what he's saying here, but we still have to ask ourselves the fundamental question: how important is this silence and solitude to our spiritual growth? He thinks the reason these people were great saints is because they withdrew themselves from the society of men. All right. He continues. A certain one has said, and I don't know which, he just says a certain one has said, and I don't know which one he's referring to here. He's got it in quotations, but I'll quote what he is reading here. He's writing down a quote from someone. As oft as I have been among men, I returned home less a man than I was before. Let me read this quote again. As often, and I'll just kind of modernize it, as often as I have been among men, so as often as I have been among men, I returned home less than a man that I was before. The more I spend time among men, I come back less than a man than I was before I went and hung out with them. The more I spend time with them, I become less than a man. I become less than something. It takes something from me. And this we often find true. When we talk long together, it is easier altogether to hold one's peace than not speak more words than we ought. It is easier for a man to keep himself well at home than when he is abroad. So he's saying that it's true that we lose something when we're around people because it's easier. I don't know if he means easier like it's just easier to do. I think he's saying it's better to hold one's peace than to speak more words, because the more words we speak, then we typically say something we should not say. So we should speak less, and that's better. The more we speak, then in a sense we become less because we end up hurting ourselves and saying words that we shouldn't. He says it's easier for a man to keep himself well at home than when he is abroad. I don't know that. I don't know if that to be true. I think when you're abroad, there are temptations and dangers, but I think when you're alone at home, there's temptations and dangers. I think no matter if we're home alone or if we're abroad, there's always going to be problems. Now, he may be saying, but if we are home alone, we have a greater chance for spiritual benefit. Yeah, if we use it for that. He goes on to say, He therefore who let me read this again. He therefore who intends to attain to the more inward and spiritual things of religion must with Jesus depart from the multitude. So according to Thomas à Kempis, if you intend to attain to the more inward and spiritual things of religion, if you really want to focus on the inward and spiritual things of religion, then you have to, with Jesus, depart from the multitude. And he has here, I believe it's Matthew 5:1. I believe it's Matthew 5:1. Let me look here. I believe it's Matthew 5:1. I think it's what he's making a reference to here. All right. Matthew chapter 5:1. And seeing the multitude, he went up into a mountain. And when he was set, his disciples came unto him. Yeah, but he still teaches the disciples here. But I could find other verses probably better to that he's. I think that's what he's referring to. He may be referring to some of the other places that speaks of Jesus departing from the multitude and going into the wilderness, going into a deserted place. But let's think this through. So if you really want to attain to the more inward and spiritual things, you have to depart from the multitude. Here's what I will say. There has to be times of departing from the multitude. There has to be times of solitude and silence for spiritual benefit. Now, I cannot say that's always going to be, I'm not going to say that's just inherently makes you better, but I think there has to be times where we withdraw ourselves from others for time of reflection, for confession, for prayer, for intercession, for petition, for Bible study, for meditation. There has to be those times. There has to be. He goes on, no man safely appears abroad, but he who gladly hides himself. So in other words, this is a powerful idea. No man can safely appear abroad. You can't spiritually safely appear abroad among other people who hasn't gladly hidden himself. So if you don't hide yourself, then you cannot safely appear among other people. That is Thomas à Kempis's position. It is the solitude, and I do agree with this. It's the solitude and silence that should prepare us to be around people. All right? It should, but all right. No man safely speaks, but he who will willingly holds his peace. You can't safely speak to people unless you find times that you willingly hold your peace. You know when you willingly silence yourself. No man safely rules. You can't safely rule over people and lead people, but who is willingly in subjection. If you want to be a leader, you got to be in subjection. You got to be in subjection to God. If you want to be a parent, you got to be in subjection. If you want to be a good leader, a good pastor, you've got to be in subjection to God. So if you want to be abroad, you have to learn to be alone. If you want to be able to speak, you got to learn to hold your peace. If you want to rule, you have to learn to be in subjection. No man safely commands, but he who has learned well to obey. No man safely rejoices unless he has within him the witness of a good conscience. All right, we'll read one more paragraph here. And yet always the security of the saints was full of the fear of God. Neither were they the less anxious and humble in themselves, for they shined outwardly with great virtues and grace. But the security of bad men arises from pride and presumption, and in the end it turns into a man's own deceiving. Let me read this again. And yet always the security of the saints was full of the fear of God. Neither were they the less anxious and humble in themselves, for they shined outwardly with great virtues and grace. In other words, they shined outwardly because these virtues and grace were developed inwardly, and, well, solitude, silence, I think is the idea. But the security of bad men arises from pride and presumption, and in the end it turns into a man's own deceiving. All right, I'll stop right there. That's some pretty good stuff. It is interesting. This paragraph here where he almost argues for you to be good at this, or for you to be strong in this, you have to be strong in the opposite. It's kind of an interesting perspective. In other words, if you want to be able to safely speak to others, then you have to learn to hold your peace. In other words, you need to be able to practice silence if you really want to be able to speak. If you want to rule people, you have to learn subjection, because no man can safely command, but who has learned well to obey. No man safely rejoices unless he has within him the witness of a good conscience. That's kind of an interesting perspective. But I will argue you couldn't even have that perspective without doing a lot of thinking and meditating. So, how critical is solitude and silence to your spiritual life? He doesn't really, what's interesting about Thomas à Kempis, he kind of just makes the assertion. He doesn't really feel the need to try to prove it. He doesn't really feel the need to try to, hey, here's the reason you need to do it. He just says, this is what you should do. Now, he kind of gives us just a hint that Jesus withdrew it. Well, he doesn't really try to prove it. I guess he tries to argue for it by doing two things, pointing to the saints of the past and pointing to Jesus. So here's what I would challenge you to do. There's not a lot of them, but find every example in the New Testament of Jesus withdrawing himself from the multitude. And just ask yourself, how can that practice of what Jesus did become a part of your spiritual discipline? And because that at least challenges that it's necessary. It at least challenges us that it's necessary. So just find the scripture. There's probably not a lot. I remember when I was a teenager, there was some kind of Bible study I did where I had to look them all up, and I don't remember them. It makes me mad that I remember the Bible study, but I don't remember all of the scripture. I know there's a couple where Jesus withdrew himself. Jesus withdrew himself. Jesus withdrew himself from the multitude. We should just find all of them just to at least look. If Jesus is our example, right? Then we have to learn from that example in some way, shape, or form. We have to figure out how can that become a part of my life. Jesus had great responsibility. He had people following him. He had things to do, but yet he found that time to withdraw himself. Now, for some people, it's easy. For some people, it's easy for me. I just drive out here with the key, open up the door, walk into a building, and here I am. I'm completely alone. It's easy. Not everyone has a building they can go to. Not, especially parents of large families where there's 17 children, that's hard to do. So I don't think that this should become an issue where one feels like you're less than a Christian if you do this. I just think that there is some aspect of solitude and silence that seems to be critical. There's this idea where if we're going to be strong in this, we almost have to be strong in the opposite. And I think that's an interesting concept. Hey, if I want to be able to be safe in my speaking, where my speaking is proper and glorifies God, I got to learn to be silent. If I want to learn to be a leader, I got to learn to be in subjection. I think that's just an interesting concept that could be fleshed out a little bit. But I'll leave it all right there with you. Just look up the scriptures that speak of Jesus withdrawing himself, and just ask yourself, if Jesus did this, then clearly it's important. I mean, he was the Son of God, and he did it. I think sometimes I think we often say that we cannot see ourselves as we truly are until we see God as he truly is. And I truly believe that, and I preach that all the time. I can never see myself as I truly am until I see God as he truly is. But at the same time, I think you can see God as he truly is and still not completely see yourself as you truly are until you spend some time alone with self, examining self, thinking, because sometimes it's only in solitude and silence where you can be honest with yourself. I think there's something to that. All right. You can email me, newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com. And hopefully this discussion was beneficial. And again, we are still in chapter 20 of book 1 of the Imitation of Christ. We've got a long ways to go to finish this chapter. This chapter goes from page 41, page 42, page 43, and page 44. The next chapter doesn't start to page 45. So this is a long chapter in the book. And then the next one is contrition of heart, which, interesting enough, he starts chapter 20, in chapter 20, he talks about we need to read things that lead to contrition of the heart. And in chapter 21, he's going to pick up contrition of the heart. So he may have had something in mind there that he wanted to accomplish, and we'll try to figure that out in future episodes. All right, everyone have a great day. God bless.